Hey everybody! Today we are here to round off our more in-depth review of the big 5 personality traits. Today we're doing openness, which is maybe one of my most favorites because it's one of the weirdest. So, trait openness. What is it? Now, as the name would suggest, it is openness, as in openness to experience and openness to new things, new events, and people who are very high in openness tend to be very intellectual, for example, tend to be very creative, interested in art, interested in sort of music, painters, poets, things of that sort. But then conversely, there's also the intellectual, so the philosophers, for example, and even your physicists, for example, because physics is a very strange realm of things, and generally just curious people. So there's a lot of sort of the tendency for exploration and things of that sort. Your entrepreneurs tend to be very high in openness. Basically, you can't be an entrepreneur if you're not very high in openness as well. And so all of those cool things, all of those things that generally a lot of people wish they were, all right? You generally find people being very jealous of anyone who has high intellectual ability or high musical ability and things of that sort. Actors, you know, those tend to be the type of people that we really covet. Also your inventors. So for example, someone like Steve Jobs, for example, he would have had to be, you know, your very entrepreneurial types. The iPhone, for example, was a revelation, the iPad and all of these kinds of things. And you get these people throughout history that have just had these sparks of genius, this where they've invented something that's completely revolutionized technology, revolutionized the world and things of that sort. And it's very interesting that a lot of people would not really associate, generally speaking, if you ask the average person, they wouldn't associate, necessarily put highly creative people like poets and things, and poets and painters necessarily in the same category, personality category, as someone who was an inventor, for example, had like technical genius, for example. But they're actually both of those sorts of people lie under the trait of openness. And the reason for that is because even to invent something, you have to be open to making. You have to be open to things that your average person wouldn't normally notice. So that's basically, to describe someone who's openness, it's high in openness, is their field of perception is a lot more attuned to the irregular connections that things might have, right? So for example, if you want to just an interesting fun test, right? In a group of people, if you want to play this at home, for example, take any object out in your home, for example, and let's say a brick, and go around the circle of people and say, well, how many different uses can we find for a brick, right? Now you'll find the average person will come up, most people will say paperweight, for example. And so you need very low creativity, very low openness, because, you know, it's heavy. It's sort of the first thing you see. But then people who would say, well, it could be if we paint eyes on it and turn it into a puppet, it could be Mr. Brickman, for example, and make a superhero comic out of Mr. Brick, you know. That would be someone that's very high in creativity, and be like, so most people wouldn't even go there, you know. They would be like, what could we use? And they would try to think of practical reasons for the brick, but all of the uses for a brick are not necessarily only the practical reasons. There might be other sort of crazy sort of things. Someone who's high in creativity would be like, well, drill a hole in it and use it for a pot plant sort of thing, for example, or candles, or, you know. So the more high in openness the person is, not only will the variety of uses for a single object be, they will come up with a lot more uses, but the uses that they come up with will be a lot more unusual then at the same time. So it is so that's a trait of openness for you. And then conversely, people who are very low in openness, another word for it would be narrow-minded. So and we all know people like this. And again, there's pros and cons to absolutely everything. People, so narrow-minded people who are set in their ways, people who are not really interested in so for example, right, have you ever gone into let's say at work, you're at work and you see people doing things in a particular way, and you ask the people, say, well, why do you do it like this? And they're like, because that's the way we've always done it, right? The bane of the existence of many people, right? Oh, well, we do it this way because this is just how we've always done it this way. And that will be a very, very irritating response to someone who's very, very high in openness. And those will be sort of your narrow-minded people. They're quite happy to just accept what's right in front of them and just plod on. And then moreover, people who are very low in openness. So, for example, if these people are low in openness, you will say, well, this is not the best way of doing it. Why don't we change the operation, and we could make it more efficient, we could make it better, or we might even be able to eliminate this operation altogether and sort of streamline the thing. And they'll be like, they'll drag their feet. They won't really want to accept any kind of changes, no matter how impractical what they're doing is. And those will be people who are very who are low in openness. They're not receptive to new things. And had no one actually come in and said this is silly, they would have never noticed, and they would have just carried on that way forever. So that then shows why people who are high in openness are very necessary in society, because they can take a society or a business, for example, that's quite stagnant, and they can go in there and they can shake things up and bring sort of a breath of fresh air and visualize sort of new ways of doing things and stuff like that. But at the same time, people who are then very low in openness would be very irritated with high in openness, because they'll be like, well, we're fine the way we are, thank you very much. You get lost with your ideas. We don't care. You're just a Looney Tune. Why are you bothering us here, sort of thing. So that's sort of a basic grasp of the difference between someone high in openness and someone low in openness. Now, openness breaks down into two subcategories, which is known as intellect and openness, or intellect and creativity. They sometimes call it openness to experience, but I believe at least a personal preference, and you see all of these words used in the literature. So for the sake of clarity, and specificity, let's say, it breaks down into intellect and creativity. So the intellect, so for example, intellect is, as it implies, is your intellectuals, those who are interested in the more philosophical things. They like to discover new facts. They like to do experiments. They like to research. So your physicists, your mathematicians, and people like that will be very high in openness with all the funny things that happen. Your astronomers and things of that sort, quantum physicists, things of that particular kind. Whereas then on the creativity side, you then have all your painters, you have your musicians, you have your poets, you have your writers. So people who publish novels and things of that sort will be very high in openness. So for example, if you take some of the greatest works, people like Dickens, for example, and Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, and all these will be people who are like insanely high in openness, but specifically creativity trait, and even possibly quite high in intellect trait. If you think about, for example, Tolkien, not only did he produce an entire new fantasy world, but he also invented new languages and things like that. So there would be high intellect and things like that as well. But those are basically two separate domains. They don't necessarily have a lot to do with each other, but they do overlap. So for example, you can't be highly so for example, a lot of music, so the best music in the world, and at least in terms of lyrics, and the best poetry are those who are actually very highly philosophical. For example, they're talking about the deep meaning things. So and this is actually something a lot of people complain about with the music, the popular music these days, is it's very brainless, it's dim-witted, it's idiotic. Like Beyonce's "Girls Run the World." It's totally retarded. There's no depth to it whatsoever, and you often have these memes out on social media where people lament the sheer stupidity of the lyrics of modern music. and you find that there's this longing among people to for the music of the old days, where lyrics actually used to mean something. It wasn't just about the bass. It wasn't just about the tunes that came through, how loud you could pump it and all that kind of stuff. It was about quality, it was about nuance and things like that. So you'll find that generally people who are narrow-minded will actually appreciate the rubbish music a lot more than the people who are a lot more open. So the higher in openness people are, specifically creativity and even in intellect, you'll find that their taste in music is a lot more nuanced. There's a lot more depth to it and things like that. Whereas the more further down you come in openness, then there's the more mundane stuff. And this is the danger. So a lot of people attribute this to the fact that the music industry has virtually monopolized all music, right? And they're only about making money, and that's the thing, because those who drive once you have a system built up, systems run very well by people who are high in conscientiousness, and people who are high in conscientiousness are not necessarily very open, so they're only interested in the bottom line. And so any system, in order to function, you will then find has an overrepresentation of people who are high in consciousness who make the system chug away, and then all of the subtlety and the nuance then of music, what it's actually for, then goes completely out of the window, because they're not concerned about that. People who are high in conscientiousness, they just want to work and get the music out and produce as many and make the money and all that kind of stuff. Whereas people who are high in openness are not necessarily concerned about these things. So you've got your intellect and you've got your creativity. Those basically how they separate out. They do overlap, obviously. So if you're a complete idiot, you're not going to do well. If you're low, so you need a sort of an intellectual, philosophical mind, for example, like which you would generally find in the intellect side, in order to produce high quality lyrics and high quality literature. Actually, some of the best literature on the planet are those that have the most philosophical depth to them. You will generally find, and even the most popular movies, right? If for example, if you think about the Marvel movies at the moment, they're incredibly popular, really popular. And a lot of people wonder, well, why is this the case? It's not just because it's flashing lights and action and stuff all over the place, but it's because on a philosophical level, all of the Marvel heroes get how can I say, they bring out certain psychological archetypes, and they get them perfectly right, which is one of the reasons why people like the Marvel stories. So for example, if you think about the Incredible Hulk, right? The Incredible Hulk is basically civilized man, right? So Bruce Banner, he's a scientist, he's a man of intellect, right? But the man of intellect also has then the primal man inside, and it's basically that inner battle between the higher, the intellectual man versus the primal man, the rage and all of that sort of thing. And there's very deep psychological archetypes in all of these characters, and then you take someone like, for example, Iron Man, right? Why does Iron Man appeal to people? Well, Iron Man he's technological man. He's an atheist, right? So for example, Iron Man could be best described as the modern atheist, right? He's the technological man, and he's very successful. He's irreverent, he's cocky. He's very sure of himself and all that sort of thing. He's not necessarily the most philosophically robust individual. He's all about let's have fun, and let's forget about all of these burdensome weights of things, and let's just go out and research and explore and all these kinds of things. But then you find at the same time, if you watch the Iron Man movies, Tony Stark, he's forced to confront the philosophical depth of his existence. So he finds that his weapons land up in the hands of terrorists, which causes him a crisis of conscience. And so you see Iron Man is like the modern atheist, is like technological man, for example, and he's confronted with the fact that there is more to life than just the material world. You have to think about objective morality, about ethics, and all of these kinds of things. And so a lot of people then relate to him quite a lot, because he's irreverent and all these kinds of things. Whereas then you have Captain America appeals to a completely different type of people. Captain America, he has his faith, which is why he's got a shield. These things are not by accident. So Captain America, his weapon of choice is a shield, right? And he's a very religious man. So in faith, you talk about faith is your shield, and he's the pillar of morality. He believes in God. He always does what's right. He doesn't struggle with moral and ethical issues. He's straight as an arrow, and his moral compass is right, and he's only. And the interesting thing is, like, if you look at the history of philosophy, right, Christianity suffered a lot with the rise of modern technology and stuff, and the rise of the modern man. But what we have found in the modern days is that technology has actually strengthened Christianity quite a bit. So we find that even though Captain America in the beginning, he was a bit of a weakling and all that kind of stuff, science actually helped him become quite a lot more robust. And we find that you had pre-scientific religiosity, and then post-scientific religiosity with people like Isaac Newton and things of that sort, which gave Christianity a significantly greater strength in order to be a philosophical force in the world. So that is why, and a lot of people don't think about this, but that is why the Marvel movies are so popular. It's not just because they are these incredible feats of cinematography, but because they're actually very, very philosophically robust, and we don't necessarily realize it when we're watching it, but these things are playing out, and they get the archetypes right, and we're in there. And so it's very, very highly philosophical. So it's borrowing from the two worlds, the creativity as well as the intellectual. So that's why these things are so powerful. Now, interestingly enough, of all of the personality traits, it must be known that of all of the personality traits, intelligence, so when we talk about intelligence, I'm talking about IQ specifically, like your IQ score, right? Which is an objective scientific standard of measurement of intelligence. So what happens is, of all of the personality traits, IQ is the most highly correlated with trait openness. Now, not 100%. So when we're talking about correlations, right? It's like how much of a trait is explicable through intelligence. And so if when we do correlations, you work from 0 to 1. So 0 is there's no correlation whatsoever. So intellect has nothing to do with it. And 1 would be if you get a correlation of 1, then it means that intellect has everything to do with it. It explains all of the variables. And what they found, that depending on the studies, and as always, I will put the studies and the articles and things in the description of the videos below. Now, what they find is that with openness, they find that IQ is correlated at about between 0.3, depending on the study that you look at, between 0.33 and 0.45, more or less, which means that IQ is responsible for about between 30 to 45% of the variables, when you're doing research and you understand how the research and stuff is done, it's actually quite a significant correlation, and is the biggest correlation of all the other personality traits. So for example, you do actually get, so for example, if you think about conscientiousness, people who are high in conscientiousness, IQ is actually also does correlate to conscientiousness, but at a much lesser degree. So you're only looking at about 0.15, 0.2, if that sort of thing, because obviously you have to have a certain amount of intelligence in order to have self-control, which is what conscientiousness is about. Higher IQ is related more to self-control, people who work hard and things of that sort, but not fully. So we find that about 30 to 45% of correlation with openness and IQ, and it makes sense because this is sort of the creativity dimension, and people who don't have a high IQ are generally not going to be interested in intellectual things and not going to be interested in writing. And here's the problem, which is why it's so devastating, because if you have an IQ below a certain point, I think the threshold is about an IQ of about 84 and below, you will struggle to even learn how to read. You will read at a very basic level, and the lower that gets, you're basically getting to the point where you functionally, there's not actually a lot you can do, which is quite devastating, because there's large amounts of the population that are actually 90, let's say 90 and below. Huge amount. You're looking at about 15% of any given population is actually at or below 90, which is quite devastating. It really is a huge problem that needs to be that scientists are actually trying to solve. So that's why the intellect in IQ is correlated to openness, because if you don't have a high degree of mathematical ability, of linguistic ability, and all of these sorts of things, you won't actually be able to produce high quality things that really make a difference out in the world. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that when it comes to education, now let's talk about education. So there's work. I'm going to talk about education and then work. So what are the implications for you in your life in education? And here we're going to talk about correlations again. IQ is more highly correlated with openness than any other trait. But here's the interesting thing: openness does not predict success in the academic world. So, for example, and this is one of the and this actually explains, for a long time people have been complaining that the educational system does not teach critical thinking. It just teaches you, all it does is teaches you to parrot fashion information, just parrot information. There's no creative thinking and all that sort of thing. And it actually comes out in the scientific literature that what they find is that educational success is not predicted by openness, is actually predicted by conscientiousness, and conscientiousness is the trait that predicts educational success. And conscientiousness are people that just work and do as they're told and get the information in and chug away, right? Which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it does show that the educational system does not cater for people who are high in openness. So, for example, and this is one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, is they see if a child is failing at school, for example, the tendency is to think that the child is stupid or might have a low IQ and things of that sort. But the fact of the matter is that that's actually far from the truth. The child could actually be a genius. The only problem is that the way that the education system is structured, it just doesn't cater for these kids at all. In fact, the education system has absolutely no idea what to do with creative people. So it's actually one of the tragedies that we see. And people who are high in openness and low in conscientiousness, they do not do well at school at all, even though they're extremely intelligent. So this is one of the things. If you're a parent, go and get your children tested for personality traits, and if they're high in openness, which is creativity and intellect, but low in conscientiousness, you then have a task to help these kids, to give them special attention, to help them get through school, or take them to a different school. So, for example, if you're low in conscientiousness but high in openness, universities and colleges, regular universities and colleges, are not necessarily a good place for you to go. You might want to go to a trade school instead, where you will get a lot more practical experience, rather than just theoretical all the time. You might not really enjoy that, at all. So there's some very serious correlations. So most people think, well, the path to success is through university. That's absolute nonsense. And what you do find is you have incredible amounts of dropout in the world today, specifically by young men. Most of the dropouts in university, college level are actually men rather than girls, and that's easily explicable, because girls in general are higher in conscientious than men are, which means that they will perform a lot better in the educational system than men will. So generally speaking, even sort of maybe a rule of thumb is that your young men will do better in a trade school or in an apprenticeship right, at a firm somewhere, rather than actually going through tertiary institutes, which do not really cater to people who are high in openness. There's almost zero correlation between high openness and educational success. And this is one of those interesting things, because a lot of people have recognized that individuals like Bill Gates and stuff like that, these people that become multimillionaires because they started tinkering in the garage, right? So it is true that is not necessarily that the path through education is necessarily the best way to go. It's the best way to go for most people, right? Because the fact of the matter is, people who are very, very high in openness with the intelligence to actually make it work through the unconventional means are exceptionally rare, right? So here's the thing. A lot of people imagine themselves to be very, very creative people, but the fact of the matter is the majority of people are not particularly creative. Just because you can draw a nice little picture or make some mobile out of junk and whatever does not necessarily mean that you're a highly creative person. Because creativity doesn't only talk about, it's not just talking about, oh, you can produce stuff. You've got to be able to produce stuff that's interesting and unusual, but also stuff that's original and actually useful, right? So just because you can, and this is actually the lament of a lot of people with artists for today, where you go to certain art galleries and the most abject garbage is up there, and people look at it, it's like, what the hell is that, you know? And that's just that's just because society has lowered its standard, and anyone that can bend wire these days is now an artist, kind of thing. It's completely ridiculous, right? So the standards of actual real genuine creativity is something is actually very, very, very rare. And as a result, and this is the thing, a lot of people envy high creative, high openness people, but it's extremely, extremely, extremely difficult world for people who are high in openness, but really, really extremely difficult, because the fact of the matter is, if you're so high in openness, the higher you are in openness, the more out of the box you are, right? Think outside of the box. And the fact of the matter is, if you think outside of the box all the time, people have no idea what the hell to do with you, right? Because you're so far out there on the fringe that people don't know what to do with you. And so you find that's why these kids, they don't succeed in school, because they'll get bored easily, right? Because they're not liable to focus and things like that. And because they're high in openness, they are interested in a wide variety of subjects all at the same time. And so when you have to sit down for 1 hour and focus on only one thing, the child is like, well, first of all, they've probably absorbed it in about 5 seconds, but because they're not necessarily interested in it, they'll forget it. And those generally are the nuisance sort of things. And it's very interesting that, specifically to note, that a lot of children who are being diagnosed with ADD, for example, might not actually have ADD. They might just be very, very high in trait openness and very low in conscientiousness. And the reasons for that is because the currently, as it stands, there is no way to differentiate between children who have ADD and children who are high in openness and low in conscientiousness and low in agreeableness. There's actually no way to tell the difference between the two. So when they say that ADD doesn't exist, there's actually a pretty good chance that ADD actually does not exist, and what they're experiencing is merely kids who are very, very high in openness, low in conscientiousness, so they won't do the daily grind so well, and low in agreeableness, which means that they'll be a bit rowdy and things like that, and if they're bored, they become destructive, right? So people who are low in agreeableness tend to be, they don't respond so well to authority, and if they get bored, then they become destructive, especially if they're low in conscientiousness. So if you find that your child is like that, they might not actually necessarily have a learning disability or anything like that. The chances are that they're probably too smart for their environment, and their personality traits don't really suit the traditional education line method of education, which means you might have to think about alternative kinds of education. Or, for example, this is one of the things where there's a difference between personality trait and character. So personality trait is your biological proclivity, and character is is something that you achieve through discipline. And this is why it's very, very important when your kids are already small. So we're talking about the age of like 1, 2, 3 and stuff like that. Why it's so important to insist that your children clean their room, put away their toys, and do it by themselves. Clean their room, put away their toys and stuff, because what you're actually doing is helping them build, if they're low in conscientiousness, you're helping them to build the skills to make up for low conscientiousness, which then would be a detriment for them later on in the educational system. So those of you who are mothers, if you go around, if you're a helicopter mom and you're constantly picking up after your children, you're doing them a disservice. Make them pick it up themselves, even if it takes whatever. Make them clean up after themselves, make them pick up after themselves. You are doing them no end of disservice later on in life, because then they will not, that helps them practice being more conscientious. And so those who are naturally low in conscientiousness because of the biological trait, low in conscientiousness trait, you help them through the development of discipline and development of character. You help them make up for that lack, which then, if they're high in openness, they can then use that to be very, very successful later on in life. So make sure of that, right? So if you find children that are low, so if you test them and they're high in openness, low in conscientiousness, one of the best things to do is help them become more disciplined and things of that sort. It'll help them no end, right? Maybe send them to martial arts or things of that sort, things which can help discipline a lot. And these things really work, physical exercise and all of that sort of thing. So ADD and ADHD are different things, is something else. The attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that's actually a separate issue, but that's just ADD. So the vast majority of I would actually believe that the vast majority of kids actually have that are described as having ADD. Chances are they don't. They just have high openness, low conscientiousness, low agreeableness. So for example, I've received a diagnosis of ADD, and I am in the 97th percentile for openness, which is ridiculously high, and I'm also I'm moderately conscientiousness, so I'm only 77th percentile in conscientiousness. Actually, no, I'm lower. I'm 60 something. Actually, let me double check this quickly here for you. I'll have a look. See, just I don't want to lie to you, you know. So, right, let me have a look here. So I'm just going to log in here quickly, right? Because I was very interested in this, and I would strongly recommend you guys go do this. So go and look at understandmyself.com is an excellent resource, right? Login was unsuccessful. Oh dear. Oh dear. Oh, still unsuccessful. Okay, I'm not going to do it now. So forget about that. That's my own bad. I should have planned properly. Right. So I'm in the sort of, I'm moderately. So to recap, I received an ADD diagnosis, and I'm in about the 97th percentile for openness, which was very, very high openness. This is why my videos are a little bit all over the place, right? Sort of thing, because I'm interested in a lot of different things all the times, and you'll see even by my videos, I discuss a lot of topics and never just one topic. So I'm all over the place with, even in terms of subject material. So I'm very, very high in openness, and I'm higher in intellect than I am in creativity. Which is why I tend to be a more fact-based individual rather than creative stuff based individual, although I am fairly high in creativity as well. I'm moderately conscientiousness, so I'm sitting at about the 60th percentile, 65th percentile for conscientiousness, which is moderate, and then I'm low in agreeableness. So I'm only in the, actually I'm average agreeableness. I'm sort of, which is low compared to women, for example, because women are higher in agreeableness than men. So I'm in sort of the 30th, 40th percentile around there, which is moderately low. And that is exactly what you would predict someone with an ADD diagnosis to have. And here's the thing is like I do not have a learning disability because I learn perfectly fine as long as I'm interested in it, right? As long as I can see that there's value and all that sort of thing. But if I'm not interested, I can't learn it. There's just no way you can get me to learn something I'm not interested in. And a lot of people will have that problem. You'll find a lot of your kids. So for example, those of you with children, yeah, I'm sure you will have heard, why do I have to learn this, right? I'm never going to use it in real life, right? Chances are this individual will be low in agreeableness, so that's why they're arguing with you in the first place, if they're low in agreeableness, and high in openness, because they're like, you know, I can't see the utility, I'm interested in other stuff. And you will find that if they are actually interested in something, you'll see that they'll be able to sit and hyper focus on that thing for like hours on end, right? So it's not that they have a learning disability, it's a personality trait issue over there, where the personality traits are this education system, it is set up for the majority, not necessarily, you know, and it's understandable as well. But you might want to take your child, if they're having difficulties at school, take them to first of all get a personality trait test to see where they are. So understandmyself.com, get a personality trait test to see where they are, and do it with them, you know, work with them and stuff like that. It's very, very good to know, even if they're young. It does change over time, but if they're very young, get them to do that, and work with them through that. See where they are in the personality traits, if they're having difficulty at school, and then give them an IQ test as well, and that will really, really help you orient them in life to see where they can go, what sort of education, which educational pathway would be the best for them. And you will do no end of good for your child if you can actually look at these particular issues. Because like I said, people who are very, very high in creativity, high in intelligence and stuff like that, the average school teacher's got no idea what to do with these, because they're so out of the box and stuff like that. One of the interesting things as well is there's a male female bias. So for example, I think five times more males get diagnosed with ADD than women do. And again, this is because of the agreeableness trait and the conscientiousness trait. So women are higher in conscientiousness and also high in agreeableness, which is one of the reasons why they receive ADD diagnosis less. But then if your daughter, for example, has ADD or is diagnosed with ADD, you can be sure that she's probably on par with where most males are for agreeableness and conscientiousness, and then openness as well. So very, very, very important to look, because if you just force them and don't cater to them and what their needs, they're gonna have very, very serious problems. So and here's the interesting thing, right? The strongest so high openness doesn't necessarily predict success, not only in education but through life. So a lot of people will look at someone that's intelligent, and the stereotype is if you've got an IQ of 120 or more, guaranteed success. That's actually not necessarily true, because the strongest predictors not only of educational success but also workplace success is actually conscientiousness, not creativity, right? Creativity is brutal. And anyone who is out there in the creative world will know exactly what I'm talking about, right? It is so difficult to monetize creative work that it's unbelievable, right? So you could actually have someone that's sort of sitting on the street who's ridiculously intelligent, ridiculously creative, but because they don't have high conscientiousness and they're very disagreeable, it means they just haven't been able to make it in the regular systems that we've got in place at the moment. And one of the things that we need to start looking at in the world is to be able to start catering more for people like that, because these people will have a very, very difficult time not only making friends with other people and getting along socially, but just being able to find anything to do or be happy with doing anything in the regular lines, because people who are very high in openness and high in creativity, man, they have to be creative, otherwise they wither and die. And it's tough, man. It's ridiculously tough. So don't think that you would necessarily want to curse yourself with very, very high levels of creativity and intellect and all of these sorts of things, because it's not It's not easy. It's not easy at all, right? A lot of people think it's very, very difficult. So, for example, we understand that it's very, very difficult for people who are in the lowest ends of intelligence and creativity, because they're a little bit dumb and things like that. But it's also very, very difficult for people who are on the opposite extreme, because society is structured to accommodate everyone, all the people who are in the middle, and not necessarily at the extreme. So if you find yourself at the extreme, either on the positive end or on the negative end, you're going to find that you're going to struggle a lot. And here's one of the interesting things as well, is high intelligence is actually a risk factor for psychological and physiological overexcitabilities. So which is generally why you find that the term mad scientist exists, right? Because they're actually finding that if you have an IQ, so what they did is they went and looked at people who were in Mensa. So in order to get into Mensa, you have to have an IQ of 120 or above, which basically means that you are in the top 2% of intelligence in the population. And they find that if you fit into that category, you're at a 20% higher risk than everyone else for psychological problems, which is very, very interesting. And so for example, if you look at me, for example, I actually fit the mold. So I'm in the 97th percentile for openness, right? I also have an IQ north of 120, and you can see that I'm all over the place. I've got nervous tics. I've got an ADD diagnosis, so I've got Tourette's, and I've got an ADD diagnosis, and it's it's a bloody catastrophe. And I used to struggle in school as well, because the teachers didn't know what the hell to do with me. So here's one of those things, and some of you may realize. So sitting in mathematics class, right, the teacher would you have like a here's a math problem, right? Figure it out. And I'd be like, right, there's the answer. And the teacher would be like, well, you need to show you're working out. And I'm like, okay, so the teacher would come to me as like, how did you get to this answer? And I'd be like, well, what's wrong? Is the answer wrong? She's like, no, the answer is right. I just want to know how you got to the answer, right? And I would give her, well, if you do this and do that and do that and do that and do that, you get that answer. And the teacher would be like, how the hell did you, what are you doing? Couldn't understand it, right? It's like, what are you doing? And so there's a lot of people, I'm sure, that resonate with this, right? Where you have your own way of doing things, right? And having your own way of doing things, just the world doesn't like it at all. The world has no idea what to do with you. So one of the reasons I know about my particular things is because my mother was very worried about me in school and stuff like that. And she eventually, it was too late for me, unfortunately. I had already gone through most of the school system performing on average. So you would have never known that I was any of these things looking at my school grades. I mean, I used to get C's and D's kind of thing, right? And you would never think, so I was a very average student. You wouldn't, looking at my grades, you would have thought nothing of me at all, But if anything, you would have thought I was a little bit of a problematic student, because I was naughty, and I was getting kicked out of the class all the time. I was very disruptive, and all these kinds of things, and very, 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 very typical for a young boy. And so my mother, being concerned, she eventually took me to be tested, and we were surprised. Wow, he's actually not so bad at certain things. And that unfortunately, that's where it left. I never had the opportunity to get tertiary education. So I've got no college. I've got no nothing. I'm one of those people who just went out into the world and just started working. I left high school and I just started working, and I learned on the job, right? So I'm involved in engineering now. Everything I know about engineering, I learned on the job. And that is actually the best way for people like me and other people like that to actually learn things, is not necessarily the academic route, but the route of an apprenticeship. And if I had done it where I could be today, if I had done an apprenticeship, it would have been brilliant. So found these things out too late, and in my time, a lot of these things weren't necessarily known and as well articulated as they are today. So if you've got a child that you suspect, you need to face it. Your child might actually just be mentally challenged in some way. They might just have a low IQ, but you won't actually necessarily be able to tell the difference. Actually, you can by seeing the child, but go and get the tests done. It's really, really worth finding out. It could really benefit your children, and you also know what to do with them, right? So that's the educational pathway. The work pathway, as I said before, I kind of touched on it a little bit. Oh, I hate allergy season. Anyway, so with the work pathway, right? You've got to be careful. If you're an intellectual and if you're high in openness and high in conscientiousness, you're going to rule the world, basically, because not only will you have the creativity and the intellect, you will also have the work ethic to be able to do anything. I mean, you're gonna rule the world. So people like the Elon Musk and Bill Gates and all of these guys, almost 100% guaranteed these guys are very, very high in openness, and they will probably be in the 90 plus percentile of openness, and be in like the 90 plus percentile in conscientiousness, because these guys work like crazy and are creative as hell, so that they've produced stuff that has revolutionized the entire world, right? And that is why these guys become millionaires. Is precisely because of that. Is not only because they're obscenely creative, but because they've also got the work ethic to go with it. So for example, if you find yourself in a position where you are very, very highly creative, but you're low in conscientiousness, which means you don't necessarily have the right work ethic, so you're not very organized and stuff like that, then you will want to go into business with, you can still be an entrepreneur, but then what you want to do is go into business with someone who's very, very high in conscientiousness, that doesn't mind running the business in terms of the nitty-gritty details or the legal stuff and things like that, where you can be left to do like research and development and stuff like that, and do the interpersonal skills with other people and market and all these kinds of things. So you will then find that you will want to go into business. And even if, for example, let's say you are someone who is low in openness but high in conscientiousness, you want to go and find someone who's a complete nut job but is creative as hell, and get in and get into business with them or employ them, because these guys are going to come up with crazy ideas, and one of those ideas might make you an absolute millionaire if you can then take that idea and then capitalize on that. You'll be doing very, 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 very well for yourself. So that's where these people need to work together. But your work prospects are very difficult. Now, here's something you need to realize is if you're very, very high in, and this is why it's difficult for people who are high in openness, but let's say low in conscientiousness, is because in the working world, you always start at the bottom and work your way up. Now, here's the thing. Creativity is valued at the top of an organizational structure more than it is at the bottom. When you're at the bottom, you're just expected to follow orders, do what you're told, don't ask questions, just chug away like a good little soldier. And if you stick to it, if you can possibly manage it, right? So this is my advice for you people who hate the daily grind and stuff like that. You can only climb the higher. Maybe you're ridiculously lucky and you can find yourself at that top position. And this is why an education sort of at a university level allows you to skip a lot of the bottom up progress and go straight for one of the top positions, in which your creativity, you are then free, like in high managerial positions, entrepreneurial positions, where you are then free and have the autonomy to do your own thing. So it allows you to skip that. But those of you who are not academically inclined, for example, what you'll have to do is, because you will wither away completely if you are not creative and you're not doing whatever. So here's my advice, right? Because if you find yourself in a crappy situation, hey, that's life. You gotta take lemons and make lemonade, right? So you want to look at a company and find, this is more or less what I want to do, right? And go and start at the bottom. And stick to it. Do that daily grind and climb the ladder, because if you're really, really intelligent and you're faithful and you do your work well, right? Stick to it. You will eventually climb the ladder, right? And obviously make sure that you get into a company that's got strong opportunities for for moving up, because what a lot of major companies like to do is when they recruit for new positions, they like to recruit internally, right, and fill the bottom roles from the outside. So basically what they do is move people up, which creates a vacuum at the bottom, which then they move people from the outside in. So if you stick to it, right, whenever they're recruiting for higher positions up top, they prefer to take people internally, because those people need a lot less training, already know the business. There's not so much of an investment in. They already know who you are and all these kinds of things. So if you can stick to it, and this is where the patience comes in. And unfortunately, people who are low in conscientiousness don't have the patience and that foresight to do it. They can be impulsive. So this is where that self-discipline is very important. So if you can get in at the bottom and then work your way up, you'll eventually have the freedom to do a lot of these things. And then in order for you to not go completely, to go completely insane, what you then want to do is make sure that you have at home, you have a creative hobby. So here's the thing, right? There's no point in saying, well, I'm not going to get a steady job, right, because I only want to do something, and then you're starving, because then if you're starving, you can't be creative either, right? So everything in life is a trade-off. So what you'll do is go and get a steady job that's got future prospects towards what you want to do, which then gives you a steady income, right? It gives you a steady income, and with that steady income, you can do your creative thing on the side, and then work towards perfecting that creative side, and then maybe doing something with it. And one of the encouraging things about today is that the internet has made it possible for people who are highly creative to actually get known. So you've got all of the social media and things like YouTube, for example. I mean, there are people out there that are making ridiculous amounts of money by doing YouTube videos and doing whatever, right? So people, are you really interested in cooking? Like, for example, if you're a good cook, people who are good at cooking, you are high creative people, right? Because you need to understand something. Being a good cook means you've got to be highly creative, because it's one of those things. And so one of the ways you can tell if someone's high in openness, are they a good cook? Yes, chances are they're high in creativity, right? So let's say you really enjoy cooking. Start a YouTube channel where you show people how to cook, and start making weird, strange creations, and start from the bottom and work your way up, and get your channel, try and get your channel monetized and things like that. And that's a way forward, but at the same time, make sure you've got a steady 9-to-5 job, so that until you make success, you're not starving, right? Because if you're starving and destitute, you're not gonna do so well. You won't have the internal resources to do these things. So those are some considerations for the workplace. And if you run a business, so for example, if you run a business, man, and you see that your business is stagnating, and this is true for any organization. So whether you run a business, whether you run a church, whether you run a social group or whatever, if you find that it's stagnant, right, bring a creative person in at the high level and give them free rein to just shake things up, right? And they'll be able to breathe fresh life into an organization. And fortunately, nowadays, as this psychological data is becoming more and more well known, a lot of companies are catching on to the fact that even if a person doesn't necessarily have a good work ethic, it might be worth to bring them on anyway, because their creative genius is actually extremely useful within the structures of a business. And so businesses are now looking, slowly but surely, are beginning to cotton on to the fact that you don't just want a whole bunch of mindless soldiers to crack on and do the work. Sometimes you want these creative wingnuts to come in there and blow the hinges off things and be like, oh, why don't we do this? And it's very essential. Now, and here's the battle. One of the things that you find, the battle in life generally happens between people of high openness and people of high conscientiousness, because people who are high conscientiousness, low openness, are narrow-minded and like things like this, whereas people who are high in openness like things out of the box, all over the place. And so people who are high in conscientiousness find people who are high in openness as too whimsical and disorderly and, you know, crazy, whereas people who are high in openness, they find conscientious people too restrictive and oppressive and stuffy and you know, kind of thing. But the fact of the matter is, you need each other. You really, really, really need each other, because the world, and try to build a world in which both can succeed, right? And so the conscientious people keep the world chugging away and working like clockwork, whereas the creative, the highly intelligent people, they're the ones making all the, they're the ones breathing new life into systems and discovering new things and making things more beautiful. For example, you know, things, the interest in aesthetics, you know, nice clothing, nice pictures, nice, you know, art, the stuff that makes things beautiful and that breathe and that gives a life and an energy. Those are where the high openness people are. And so we need to be careful that open people must be careful that they don't overwhelm people who are low in openness, and people who are low in openness and high in conscientiousness need to be careful that we don't stifle and suffocate people who are high in openness. And this leads me on to the next point, right? Is in a relationship, you will find that in a relationship dynamic, you will have the same battle, right? Where people who are high in openness will have very, very different expectations of a prospective partner than someone who's high in conscientiousness and low in openness. So, for example, there's quite a big difference in openness between myself and my wife. She's ridiculously high in conscientiousness, and she's actually quite high in openness, but nowhere near as high as I am. And I can be a little bit too much of an out there wingnut for her, and sometimes she looks at me as like, you crazy. But we've learned to work together, because she doesn't necessarily like change and things of that sort, and we've learned to work together. We can rather than fight each other, we can allow each other the spaces to bring out our best and things like that, and sort of see where their expectations and stuff are. So, for example, when we first met, my wife, she didn't really like to discuss ideas and philosophical things and stuff like that. It was just way too overwhelming for her. It's like, you know, shut up, don't confuse me with subtleties and things of that sort. And I found that I myself was I didn't often get a chance to express myself with my wife, which is why you get a partner. You want to be able to express yourself in various ways and talk about a variety of things and stuff like that. And so we were both a little bit frustrated because I was overwhelming her and I was not getting necessarily what I wanted from her. And then we both had to develop our characters in such a way where we could be more balanced and then sort of give each other what we like. And this, for example, even if I think about my family life, the vast majority of the familial problems that I have with my family are the fact that I'm so completely out there in this, and that it just blows the hinges off a lot of things with the family. They're like, what the hell do I do with this guy? It's like, what? Sort of thing. And my family is tends to be a lot more sort of rigid with certain things, and it's got to be like this, otherwise no. And you know, and it's always been a constant battle, and I'm sure there's these sorts of things in families out there as well, and so we need to make these accommodations and stuff like that. Now, the danger with people high in openness is you can actually obviously go overboard. I mean, sometimes you need to learn, and this is the development, you can go too far, right? So you can go way too far. So, for example, people who are very high in openness are more likely to try things like drugs and drink and all of these kinds of things, and have these out of mind experiences and stuff like that. So, here's one of the interesting things. There's a study that actually talks about let's have a look over here. Mystical experiences and people who where is it? A study. Mystical experiences occasioned by the hallucinogen psilocybin lead to an increase in personality domain of openness. So one of the interesting things is what they found, that, if I'm not mistaken, psilocybin is found in magic mushrooms. So what they found, and it's a very remarkable thing. It shows how much of this stuff is really, really biological, where if you take psilocybin, you can induce like a mystical experience, and then after this experience with with psilocybin, if you go to people and you give them a personality test, you will find that they become significantly higher in openness, in trait openness, right? And that change is permanent, right? So they've measured these people even up to a year later, and their openness and the increase that they had in trait openness is still the same. So it's actually unbelievable. It really is unbelievable, and it's helping us understand sort of the basis, because one of the things that one of the difficulties is we have not been able to understand where in the brain openness is necessarily sort of located. What is the neurological basis for it and stuff like that. It's a little bit tricky to actually discover where it lies. So it's been a bit difficult to really nail these things down. But yeah, one of these things that you can do, and I'm not saying go oh no, I'm not saying go try magic mushrooms, because I've known people that have done that and have come drastically short. Because the thing is, right, so people who are very high in openness, so if you watch things like, there's a movie called Beautiful Minds, right, where the guy who was seeing other people, that's actually so earlier on I discussed the fact that people who are very high in openness, high intelligence, there's a significantly higher risk for certain psychological disorders, schizophrenia sort of being among them, where they can be like these ridiculously creative people, and you can be so open where you can actually see things that are not there. So for example, you found this guy in A Beautiful Mind where he was a bit paranoid, where he was making all of these conspiratorial associations. So he had this whole wall and all of these conspiratorial how can you say, links that weren't actually true, but he associated things where people did not see correlations before. And so whilst that is very useful to see new things, if it goes overboard, you can actually get to the point where you're seeing things that are not actually necessarily there. And it's hard, man. It can be tough. It can be really tough. So those of you who believe that high creativity and all that kind of stuff is necessarily a good thing, it can actually be a little bit of a curse, man. It's really difficult, man. It's not that easy. It's not that easy to be someone who's ridiculously high in trait openness and as well as high intelligence, high IQ. It's not necessarily a good thing. You become at risk for certain things, and it's not a lot of fun, man. Let me tell you. So there's one of the pros is also what they found is that the higher you are in openness, the better. So there's a higher risk for certain psychological disorders, but then for other disorders there's lower risk. So for example, if you are high in openness and you have high intelligence, high in creativity and stuff like that, you are a significantly lower risk for things like Alzheimer's and those kind of neurologically degenerative diseases. And the reason for that, they've discovered, is that because you are much more prone to use your brain, then the tendency for your brain to atrophy, which is what these disorders actually represent, is then staved off. So what they found, for those of you that have these issues or are concerned about these issues, what they've found that physical exercise will help you generate, because what happens, one of the very recent discoveries is they found that brain cells can actually regenerate, right? They didn't realize it before, but new evidence is coming out that brain cells can actually regenerate. Now here's the thing, physical exercise helps you generate new brain cells, but intellectual exercise helps you keep them, prevents them from dying off, right? So people who are high in openness are much more inclined to go and study and read and create and basically use their gray matter quite a lot, right? They're always reading, they're always this is always buzzing. My wife this is one of the weird things, right? My wife can actually be like, Morgan, I can hear you thinking, right? Have you ever had someone say that to you? And I'm like, how do you know? And she's like, and we haven't been able to explain it, man. I haven't been able to explain it at all. So if one of you have an answer to this, please let me know. Put it in the comments or something. Let me know. she's like, she can actually, I don't know how she does it, but she says you're just buzzing. It's like, I can, even if you're sitting perfectly still, I can hear you going and everything's going on. And I'm like, wow, you know, that's actually quite strange. And you'll find that you can be like that. So that maintains and staves off, and which is why they found, for example, things like Sudoku and doing crossword puzzles, they recommend that to people who are getting older, because the more you use your brain, it's like your muscles, right? If you don't use your muscles, you will lose muscle mass, right? But if you use your muscles, you will actually gain muscles. You know, they will increase and you will maintain them, and they won't atrophy, and you will maintain your strength. And this is why, as you're getting older, one thing you must do is keep the mind going, keep the mind going. If you want to stave off things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and stuff like that, start exercising. First of all, start exercising, sort out your diet, and use your brain. Even if it's only for a few minutes a day, use your brain, and you're going to stave off all of these issues. It's you can't, and man, Alzheimer's and these things are devastating. You don't want it, right? There's almost nothing too extreme that you could possibly do, right? If you think exercise every day and go vegan, if you think that's extreme, try having Alzheimer's, man. It's devastating. It's like, don't mess around with that. So if you are at risk, or if you're concerned about it, start exercising, start eating properly, and use your brain on something. Go and be creative. Start painting, start building something. Go do something, right? Go be creative. Don't just sit rotting your mind in front of a television all day. It's going to ruin you. So, wow, that I've just gone on, haven't I? That this is one of my I really like this. So I think that's it, man. I think that's it. Why did this restart? Some of these pages are really quite irritating. They have a timeout. Like, you can't just sit there and read. So openness. Yeah, so here's an interesting thing. Journal of Personality, very interesting journal. Check it out. Openness to experience and intellect differentially predict creative achievement in the arts and the sciences. So this is just affirming what I said. If you are very high in openness, so for example, you can be very high in openness, right? But then when you look at the traits, for example, you can be very high in intellect and very low in creativity, or very high in creativity, very low in intellect, or very high in both, right? Which means that depending on where you are, you will either do better in the sciences, or you will do better in the arts, sort of your humanities and things like that. And if you're high in both, well, then there's nothing you can't do. Those are the people that are very irritating. It's like they can play the piano like Mozart, and they can do science like Hawking kind of thing. It's very irritating, right? Those people that have like 7 degrees, 7 PhDs and stuff like that, you know. Also, if they're like 90th plus percentile in intellect, 90th plus percentile in creativity, and then 90th plus percentile in conscientiousness, it's like there's nothing they can't do. Those are those people that have like seven PhDs. They can play the piano, they can play the violin, they can paint, they're like superhuman. This is very irritating. So like your Leonardo da Vinci type people, right, where he was this brilliant artist, but he was an inventor, and there was like nothing the guy couldn't do. It was like ridiculous, right? Totally ridiculous. So that's it, man. So depending on where you are, so that's why it's good to do the personality test, because if you can see where you are, where you should maybe be more inclined. So for example, if you're undecided, you might find that your intellect and your openness might be quite close, but one will still be slightly more dominant than the other. So if you look at them and nicely, then you can see, right, I might want to pursue intellectual things a little bit more than artistic things, and you can sort of find how you should maybe orient yourself in life, and can give you some orientation and all of these sorts of things. And obviously, depending on how you balance out with all the rest of your traits, it can help you orient yourself in life. Very useful, man. Very useful. stuff to know. Absolutely, like brilliant stuff to know. Change your life, man. And if you're a parent, it'll help you know what to do with your kids, especially if you find that there's some kind of problems and things like that, man. It's very, very helpful. Just one more word on the disorders. So, for example, a lot of people have noticed, like people like what was his name? That painter who did all that abstract stuff. As he went crazy, his stuff got progressively weird. You know, obviously, it completely escapes me. I'm just going to research here on the internet quickly. Stupid. And right, so artists who suffered mental illness. No. So Van Gogh, on the tip of my tongue, it just wouldn't come out. You know, kind of, it's ridiculous because my brain's all over the place. Right. So Vincent Van Gogh, you can almost track his painting through his. The stuff was sort of nice and creative, and got as his psychosis sort of progressed, his art got progressively more totally abstract and completely insane. And people like Beethoven, Vincent van Gogh, Edvard Munch, I believe, or maybe I butchered his name, Foster Wallace, Georgia O'Keeffe. So all these brilliant people that had like mental disorders, Sylvia Plath, Goya, you know, Anne Sexton, you know, just to name a few people that. So if you look at the, for example, here's one of the interesting things, right? One of the biggest geniuses of our time, Stephen Hawking, and he had that degenerative problem sort of thing. So for some strange reason, right, you know, people who are very, very high in intelligence just seem to have disorders. And it's interestingly enough, when you talk about, for example, autistic people, they generally find that autistic people tend to be like ridiculous geniuses in certain things in life. They're like, what? How do you explain that, right? It's really, really quite incredible. So, for example, it's actually quite interesting if you think about the autism, right? Or people who have autistic, at least this is my experience with autistic people. I'm very, very close to some autistic people, but like very, very close. And they think in things very, very literally, in almost like a computational kind of way. So this almost seems like because they have difficulty with abstractions, say, so a person with autism thinks very literally about everything. So it's almost like they're very, very high in openness, but high intellect trait rather than creativity trait. So, for example, you will see, like, there was this guy where they took him on a helicopter flight over London, and he looked at London and then came back on the ground and was able to draw from memory in perfect scale representation, draw all of London. And people like, and this guy suffers autism. They're like, what the heck is going on here? And what's probably going on there is because people with autism think in an exceptionally literal kind of way. So almost they think they think, how can I say, what's the best way to they think like a computer, right? Their brains function like a computer. So they tend to be, on average, they tend to be completely useless at abstractions, right? So, for example, if you ask a person, the average person, draw a picture of a house, you'll like a little square with a little triangle with a little chimney and 2 windows and a door, right? That's not actually a house. That is an abstraction of a house. So you basically, what you've done is you've taken what's common. You take like 1,000 houses, take what's common amongst all of them, put them all into one thing, and then you generate an icon of a house. Whereas an autistic person, if you ask them, think of a house, they will think of a very specific house, right? Because they don't have that ability to generalize, and that causes a lot of problems. But in other ways, it helps them to be extremely successful. And generally, you find that they're extremely successful with things like mathematics. Like a lot of mathematical absolute geniuses tend to be autistic because they think in a very literal their brains actually work almost exactly like computers, where they can just calculate just like that. And what's actually going on with this guy, that he does almost like this, he's almost got like this eidetic memory, this photographic memory, is because what he's doing is when he's painting this picture, it is almost this inability to make an abstraction that is giving him the ability to recall perfectly the image, so that when he's drawing this picture, he's actually, rather than drawing it in the way a creative person would, what he's actually doing is producing the drawing in the way a computer would print a picture, in like that perfect one-to-one representation. That's actually that seems to be what's going on there. Now, it might be some variation and stuff like that, but my experience in my conversations with autistic people has been that they're very, very literal people, very, very mathematical. And so generally what you will find, and again, this is why you find that autism is again diagnosed more in men than it is in women, and men are higher in trait intellect than they are in trait creativity. And so you'll find the autist men and autist women will then be absolute geniuses in intellect avenue, sort of work and functions and things of that sort. Very, very interesting. So it's yeah, it's mind-blowing stuff. It really is mind-blowing stuff. So yeah, ladies and gentlemen, man, have I told you everything? Have I told you everything that I wanted to? Because there's a lot more to say. So is that it? You know what, man, I think I'm going to leave it there. If you guys have any more questions, then for sure, go ahead and have a chat and stuff, and think about these things. It could really change your life. I know it helped me a lot to realize that I wasn't just some nut job. And a lot of you out there might be thinking, oh, I'm just some wing nut, I don't fit anywhere in the world. That's because it's partially true, but also not true. You do fit somewhere. You just have to know how to navigate things, because you navigate things differently. You would navigate the world in a sort of a non-algorithmic way. Here's another point. If you look at the literature, you'll find that people who are very high, sort of in intelligence and sort of openness and things like that, they're going to really struggle to make friends. Really struggle to make friends. They tend to be awkward socially as well. So it's not all fun and games at that side of the spectrum of things. Not all fun and games at all. It can be very difficult, because again, the higher you are in a particular trait, the fewer people there are that are there with you in that area, which means there are a lot fewer people that you can actually relate to in order to be able to form a friendship with and stuff like that. So again, if you're having a partnership, for example, so if you get together with and marry or get into a relationship with someone that is, let's say, very low in openness and you're very high in openness, and this person will want to go out, let's say, to a social situation, and you go with them, chances are you're going to be bored out of your mind. You're going to find the people are really simple, and you're not going to enjoy it at all. So when the Bible says do not be unequally yoked, it's not necessarily saying, oh, I'm better than you. It's like, no, it's very, very important to be with people who are like you are, because they will understand you. They won't misunderstand. They won't misunderstand you, man, because people can misunderstand you, dude. It's like, and I'm sure we all relate to that, right? People can really misunderstand you sometimes, and I know I get a lot where people misunderstand me, or I'm trying to say one thing and they just, and it's like, okay, well, I'm a moron. I'll, forgive me and carry on, so yeah, it can be tough. So these are things to consider. If you guys have any questions, comment, inbox, whatever the case might be, go ahead, and thank you for your time. And yeah, this was great. And so that concludes the 5 personality traits. I hope I've given you some good food for thought, some very interesting stuff. And now, if you guys watch this stuff, whenever I talk about other psychological things, so I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about autism and ADD and ADHD, and other kinds of things, obsessive compulsive disorder and all these kinds of things, I'm regularly going to refer back to these personality traits because they are so useful, even in other things, stuff that isn't necessarily related to psychology. I'm going to often refer to, so I'm going to, when I do other videos, I'm by necessity, I'm going to assume that you've watched these videos and that you've become somewhat familiar with what these traits mean and how they interplay and stuff like that. Just for, you know, which is one of the reasons why I did this, is so that I could be more free later on to just assume that people are familiar with it and will understand then what I'm talking about so that the videos can be as short as possible, so that I don't have to explain every single little thing and stuff like that. So it helps me out for making videos later on. So yeah, man, thank you very much for your time. Cheerio, God bless, and yeah, take it easy, and I'll chat to you guys soon. Bye.